Brooks said. "A backup never hurts." "Great idea," said Luke, a little too enthusiastically. Boy, he had it bad. 13. The sun rose the next morning to find us preparing to leave Walmart. We were all packed. Each of us had a full backpack and the bike baskets loaded with supplies. I loaded the shotgun ammo I found into my backpack as Luke wasn't around. "Where's Luke?" Ben asked. "I think he went to the bathroom," Sarah replied. "Here he is." Luke emerged from one of the aisles holding up a box proudly. "Crossbow," he said, and knelt on the floor. He began to rip open the cardboard packaging. At first I thought it was a toy, but when he pulled out the camouflage-patterned weapon, I saw that it was indeed real, as were the short arrows or bolts or whatever they called them. He slung the crossbow over his shoulder and secured the Velcro belt of 8 holstered arrows to his thigh. "Where did you find that?" Ben asked. "I could do with one of those, too. The bows are too big and clumsy to take with us." "Sorry, this was the last one. It was tucked behind a counter. All the shelves were cleaned out, probably in the panic after the outbreak. Here, you can have this, though." He handed Ben the shotgun. The English boy took it gingerly. "Don't worry, the safety is on," Luke said. I wasn't sure about giving up a firearm for what was essentially a medieval weapon, but I could tell from the loving way he handled it that Luke wouldn't be persuaded to give the crossbow up. We got started not long after. A mile down Highway 102, it crossed the Quaker Highway, which would lead us, after another half-mile or so, to the Providence-Worcester Turnpike. This would give us a fairly straight shot across the semi-rugged and forested southern Massachusetts countryside. It was cold and overcast as we left Walmart's parking lot, weaving our bikes between the silent cars that littered the highway. It started to snow even before we reached the turnpike. "This could be some tough sledding, boss," Luke said, pedaling up beside me. "Bicycles can be hard to ride in the snow." "Nothing we can do about it now," I replied. "If it gets too bad, we'll find some place to stop until it lets up." "What if it doesn't let up till spring?" he asked. "It's still January, after all." "Heck, I don't know. Maybe we'll come across a place with snowmobiles." The snow did let up before it started sticking to the road, but that conversation with Luke kept playing on my mind. Somehow I was beginning to feel responsible, not only for myself, but for our entire ragtag little group. What if I led them astray? The thought nagged at me as we rode. It was 19 miles from where we got on the turnpike to the edge of Worcester, and we planned on staying on it the entire way. We had only been on the turnpike for 3 or so miles when Brooks' keen eyesight caught something coming toward us. We had just passed an off-ramp, so we turned our bikes around and hightailed it back before speeding down the ramp and hiding in the bushes near the underpass. We watched the turnpike from our hideout, the others looking as apprehensive as I felt. 5 minutes later, a bulldozer and 2 trucks came into view. They were moving slowly, the dozer making sure the breakdown lane was clear, pushing the occasional abandoned vehicle out of the way. Behind them rumbled 4 tanks. American tanks. I could see the flags, and with a surge of joy I started up from our hiding position, ready to wave them down. Luke grabbed me by the sleeve and pulled me roughly to the ground. "Dude," he whispered harshly, "look at the sentry." One of the tanks had its hatch open, and the soldier leaning out of it was clearly Asian. That didn't mean a whole lot, but the flag on the shoulder of his bluish camouflage uniform was an unmistakable blotch of red. A glance into the truck cabins confirmed it. Chinese soldiers. I nodded sheepishly, aware of just how close I had come to getting us all captured, or worse, killed. "I bet they're taking any American military hardware they find," Luke said. We watched as the tanks continued past, followed by a few more trucks, and finally a single Jeep. A man with a pair of binoculars stood up in the back of the Jeep looking around at the edges of the road. My breath caught as his gaze swept over us and, in my mind at least, seemed to linger just a bit too long. I held my breath. Finally, the man turned his attention to the other side of the turnpike as the Jeep rolled on. I exhaled sharply. I wasn't the only one. "Holy crap, that was close," Luke said. I wonder if there'll be more of them using that motorway. Ben wondered aloud. Luke, does your map show a way to get to Worcester from here without taking the turnpike? I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. We waited while he rummaged around for the atlas in his pack. Yeah, he said, after opening it to the page he wanted. But it's going to be longer and take us through a lot of farmland and some small towns. Longer I can deal with, if it helps us avoid patrols, said Brooke. I'm hungry. Can we stop and eat something? Sarah asked. Typical kid, I thought, ignoring the fact that my own stomach was rumbling. Let's get a bit further down this road, away from the turnpike, and we'll stop, I said. Looks like we follow this road about a half-mile and then turn left, Luke said. That looks like a good spot to stop for a rest and some grub. Okay, let's go, I said. It was just after noon, and we were leaving the small town of North Uxbridge when we noticed we were being followed by dogs. It was, of course, Brooke who spotted them first. We have company, she said, pulling up. They followed at a distance, a pack of mangy dogs of different breeds, but all of them had a lean and hungry look. I could make out at least one Alsatian, and there were 2 other big dogs whose breeds I couldn't identify. They didn't come close to us that afternoon, just followed behind, sniffing at our trail. They look terrible, Sarah said when we stopped to rest a couple hours after we first noticed them. Who's been taking care of them, since the flu killed all the grown-ups? Probably no one, Luke responded. That's probably why they're so skinny. Maybe we should feed them, Sarah said, sadness creeping into her voice. We've barely got enough for ourselves, love, Brooke said, putting a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. Besides, if you feed a stray, it'll follow you around forever, Luke said. At least that's what my dad always said. I hope they bugger off. I think they're creepy, Ben said, mirroring my own feelings. Feeding them was the last thing I wanted to do. The thought of them being close enough to hand feed terrified me in an irrational way. I had been bitten by my grandmother's collie when I was 6 and still had the scar from a puncture wound on my wrist. We aren't going near them, I said, and tonight we're going to find a place with doors we can lock to sleep in. When we stopped for the night a couple of hours later, it was just starting to get dark. We found a farmhouse with a large detached garage behind it. The house was locked up tight, and I don't think any of us fancied breaking in. Besides, the garage door was wide open, so we wheeled our bicycles inside and pulled the big roller door down behind us. A couple of windows above a workbench on one wall allowed the dying sunlight to filter in as we set up our bedding. We ate a meal of beef jerky and potato chips as the sun went down, and by the time we finished, it was pitch black in the garage. Both Ben and Brooke had thought to bring flashlights, but to save on our limited supply of batteries, we had decided not to use them unless there was an emergency. The dogs began howling and barking sometime in the middle of the night. We could hear them growling and scratching at the garage door before what sounded like a vicious fight broke out and ended in high-pitched yelping. No one slept much after that. A whimpering Sarah curled up next to Brooke, the English girl doing her best to comfort her, while Luke and I sat upright with our weapons close by. Ben was ready with his flashlight should the sound of breaking glass or splintering wood be heard. The sound of the dogs finally died down just as dawn was breaking. Everybody but Luke and I fell into a fitful sleep. We should let them sleep a while, Luke said. We can get started again in a few hours. Okay. Everybody's exhausted from yesterday's ride and last night's excitement, I replied, stifling a yawn. You should sleep too, he said. I can keep watch. Are you sure? No sweat, man. I picked up a few energy drinks before we left Walmart. If I feel myself crashing, I'll just slam one of them. All right, if you're sure. I got into my sleeping bag and shuffled till I was comfortable. Well, as comfortable as one could be lying on a concrete floor. My eyes closed for what seemed like just a second, and suddenly I was being shaken awake. I glanced around in bewilderment. Everybody else was up and had their sleeping bags repacked. What? It's about noon, Luke said. Time to rise and shine, sleepyhead. Okay, I muttered, shaking my head, trying to clear the cobwebs from my mind. Sometimes I think a little sleep is worse than none. I got up and stretched. I wasn't quite as exhausted as I had been, but still felt like I'd been worked over by a burly man with a baseball bat. Muscles that I never knew I had were aching. I rolled up my sleeping bag and tied it before returning it to the basket on the front of my bike. Any sign of the dogs? I asked. Nope, Luke replied. When Ben woke up, I got him to watch my back while I went outside to take a whiz and have a look around. They must have found something better to do. Well, then we should probably be heading out. We've already wasted too much daylight as it is. I figure we've got maybe 5 hours of light left, Luke said. We might be able to make it to Worcester by nightfall. Luke was getting ready to pull up the door when we heard the first thrum of a helicopter in the distance. I motioned for him to leave it closed, and he nodded. The chopper flew low over the house and garage we were in, and in truth, I was waiting for huge bullets to begin tearing the garage apart at any moment. But after what seemed like an eternity, it moved off into the distance. Are they going to come back? Sarah asked. I don't know, but maybe we should wait a while before leaving. I don't want them to catch us riding down the road if they fly back this way. If we wait too long, we won't make it very far before dark, man, Luke said. Maybe we shouldn't try, I responded, conscious of my aching muscles. We could wait out the day here, spend another night, and leave early in the morning. As you Yanks would say, I'm down with that, Ben said, massaging the back of his leg. Please, can we? Sarah asked, her eyes brightening slightly for the first time since I had met her. Wouldn't bother me, Brooke chimed in. You're the boss, Luke said, shrugging. He pulled the sleeping bag off of his bicycle basket. If we're staying here, though, I'm going to get some shut-eye. I'm bushed. I'm not the boss, I said. It's just a figure of speech, man, Luke said, shrugging before unrolling his sleeping bag onto the floor. I'll take the watch tonight. You do kind of take charge and act bossy, said Sarah, smiling, with a nod of her head. The way she said it made it sound like it wasn't a bad thing. 14. It was cold in the garage, and we spent most of the day cocooned in our sleeping bags and talking quietly. We were out of the wind, which was a blessing, but a fire was out of the question. Luke slept most of the afternoon, and toward late afternoon I also nodded off. I awoke just before nightfall, when the dogs returned. We could hear them growling and snarling as they scratched at the garage door. That night we were more secure in the safety of our shelter, and the rest of my group, including Luke, even managed to get to sleep despite the dogs yammering at the door. I couldn't, however, and was awake until well after midnight with the .38 in my hand, listening to the pack. Luke awoke in those early hours and took my gun, telling me to sleep. I didn't protest. I was pretty exhausted by then. Once again, the dogs were gone before first light. We had a quick breakfast of cold beans and were ready to go within a half hour of the sun cresting the horizon. We hit the road, riding carefully to avoid patches of black ice. Sometime before midday it began snowing again, this time harder. When we stopped to have lunch in a clear spot under some trees, I worried that we wouldn't be able to make it too much further on our bikes. Where are we? I asked Luke, who'd spent most of our lunch stop studying the map of Massachusetts in his atlas. Based on that last big crossroad, I'm guessing that we're someplace right about here, he said, jabbing at a spot on the map with his finger. We're probably 5 or 6 miles from Worcester. Should make it there in another hour and a half, maybe a bit longer if the weather keeps being a dick. Now might be a good time to discuss what we do when we get there, Brooke said. Worcester's a city, and there are bound to be Chinese military there. It's probably where that chopper was headed yesterday. I know. I prefer to go around it, But that might not be possible given the weather, I said.
Going around would take us too far out of the way,
Luke chimed in.
A stealth run through it has to be the best way. It would save us time and distance.
Both paths are risky, Ben said. But given the weather especially, I think we should try to get through Worcester as soon as possible. If that means dodging Chinese patrols, then so be it. But we should wait and make a go of it after dark. Luke nodded.
It would be easier to avoid the patrols that way.
Let's go to the outskirts of town and make our decision then, I replied. Getting through seemed like the best course of action to me too, and I could see the reasoning behind making the crossing at night. The problem was, I found the thought of traveling through the cold, dark night unsettling. I looked around at the snow falling beyond the trees we were lunching under. We should get back to it. The dogs are back, and they're closer, said Sarah, tugging on my sleeve and pointing back the way we had come. I looked over my shoulder and felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. They were closer, all right. Everybody on their bikes. Let's go, now, I said. My bicycle tires slipped in the slushy covering that was beginning to form over the road for the first few turns of my pedals, but then it caught and the bike shot forward. I tucked in as a back marker behind the others, Luke in front, followed by Sarah, and then the twins. I didn't need to look over my shoulders to tell the dogs were coming. The sound of their baying told me all I needed to know. They weren't keeping their distance. This time they were chasing us down. We rode as fast as we could under the circumstances, our bikes slipping and skidding on the icy road, but it was clear that we weren't going to outrun them. We would run out of steam long before the desperate canines did. Either that or one of us would end up skidding off the road and be at the mercy of the pack. I desperately looked around for some way out and spotted a large house ahead about 50 yards away. It wasn't set as far back from the road as most of the houses around it, and the short gravel driveway was mostly clear of snow and slush. Please don't be locked. The thought shot through my head so fast that I hardly had time to register it. I sped forward. There! I shouted to the others and pointed to the house. Dump the bikes in the yard and get up on the porch. I angled dangerously off onto the driveway and jumped from the bike before it stopped. I hit the ground running, slipping in a patch of snow. I felt a sharp twang in my inner thigh as I did the splits before catching my balance. The adrenaline running through me masked the pain, and I scrambled up onto the porch, relieved to see that the others were all right there with me, adrenaline powering them all, even Sarah. Ben rushed to the door, and I turned, scrambling to pull my gun from my pocket as the dogs charged across the icy lawn. It was Luke that saved us from what may have been a disaster. With a guttural roar, he jumped off the porch, grabbed the shotgun from Ben's basket, and charged at the oncoming pack, screaming like a maniac. The sight of the crazy human was enough to cause some of the dogs to pull up and comically slide to a stop on the slippery grass. 3 kept coming. Luke fired his shotgun at the pit bull that was leading the charge, and it was flipped violently backwards by the blast. The rest of the dogs scattered, frightened by the loud blast and the yelping of their packmate. Luke paused and watched as the dogs ran off and then racked the slide of the shotgun to load another round. He stepped up to the pit bull. It was still thrashing on the ground and yelping. "Look away, everybody," he yelled. I know the warning was mainly for the girls, but I also looked away too and watched as Ben tried to jimmy the door open. We all jumped as a second blast rang out and the agonized yips were abruptly silenced. When it was done, I turned around with my revolver in hand as Luke pulled a blanket from one of the packs and covered the dead dog before joining us on the porch. Luke and I both watched the rest of the dogs with our guns ready. They had retreated to the road and had formed into a pack once again, watching us as warily as we watched them. Behind us, Ben finally gave up trying to jimmy the door and attempted to ram it open with his shoulder. Sarah began tugging at the elbow of his parka. He shrugged her off and gave the door another ineffectual charge with his shoulder. Sarah didn't give up, though. Frustrated, Ben looked down at her. "What?" She held up the shiny key she had pulled from under the corner of the welcome mat. Ben rubbed his shoulder sheepishly. "Thanks," he mumbled, and took the key. With my adrenaline running high, I had to suppress a crazy, inappropriate, given what had just happened to the dog, giggle. Luke and I stood guard as the rest piled inside. The dogs still milled aimlessly, sniffing the air in our direction, but hadn't worked up the courage to come back for more.
I motioned Luke inside, and without taking my eyes off the pack, I stepped in behind him. The house was cold, and there was no electricity or running water, or any sign that anybody had been there recently. Brooke made the mistake of opening the refrigerator door, discovering the moldering remains of a Christmas meal before slamming it closed again. Not before the smell escaped, though. "Brooke!" barked Ben, like a disappointed parent. "Oops, sorry," said Brooke, and pulled a face behind his back, drawing a laugh from Sarah. Luke started up the stairs, but about halfway up encountered a smell that made the rotting food in the fridge smell like potpourri. We didn't talk about what might be causing the stench, just agreed we would stay on the ground floor. We all traipsed into the living room. One thing the place did have going for it was a big fireplace, with a dozen or so logs sitting in the box next to it. "Can we have a fire, Isaac, please?" Sarah asked. "Tonight, maybe, when the smoke won't be as noticeable," I said. "That's if no one else objects." "Sounds good to me, man," Luke said. "I feel like it's been ages since I've been really warm." "I'm going to see if there is anything edible in this place," Ben said, moving toward the doorway to the kitchen. "I'll help you," his sister said, following him. "Should we get the stuff from our bikes?" Luke asked. "The dogs are still out there," I said, peering through the aluminum Venetian blinds. They had finally gotten the gumption to come close to the house and were sniffing around their fallen packmate. One of them, the big bristling Alsatian, sniffed at the dead pit bull, then bit into its leg. A mutt approached, and the Alsatian released the leg long enough to snap at him before chowing down again. Realizing there was food on offer, the rest of the dogs closed in and proceeded to scramble and fight over their former packmate. Feeling sick, I let the slats of the blind snap back into place. "We'll have to wait," I said, not telling them what I'd just witnessed. "Hopefully they don't get into our stuff." "Yeah." In the kitchen cupboards, the twins found lots of canned food, including Irish stew and baked beans and Campbell's soups. We all agreed that a few cans of Irish stew would make an excellent supper that night. Frankly, we were all sick of baked beans in our supplies stack and knew they would be better cold than other foods while traveling. We spent the remainder of the afternoon searching the ground floor of the big house for anything that would prove useful on our trip. Very little of what we found was actually suitable, although Sarah did uncover a box of small candy canes that we eagerly tore into. Ben discovered an old boombox-style radio with working batteries in the kitchen, and we turned it on. Running it through the FM dial, we expected to hear only static. We were shocked when we found a couple of the stations broadcasting. Our rising hopes crashed when we realized that the stations were broadcasting in Chinese. Brooke, who had taken Mandarin in school for a year, said one was broadcasting in Mandarin and she wasn't sure about the other, although we figured it had to be Cantonese. She was able to make out some of the words in the Mandarin broadcast, enough to tell that it was repeating the same few sentences over and over, but couldn't tell us what the message was. "Sorry, I only took the subject because my mates did." We flicked to AM stations, and after some frustration, we were able to find the coded message about the safe haven again, although now it was on a different frequency. Smart. It renewed my hope that if we did find this place, it would be well organized and offer real safety. To my untrained ears, the series of beeps sounded the same as before, so after a while we shut it off. "We should take the batteries when we leave. Who can say when we'll come across more with juice in them?" Luke said. By then it was getting dark, so we decided to go ahead and light the fire. I wanted to wait until it was fully dark, but the others were impatient, and the look of longing on Sarah's face melted my resistance. We lit the fire just as dusk fell. As the stew simmered over the fire, Sarah pulled out some old board games she had found under the sofa in the living room. "We should play one," she said. "What have you got there?" Luke asked. "Let's see. Backgammon, Monopoly, Trouble, and Chinese checkers," she said, reading off the boxes. We were all thinking it, but as usual, it was Luke who made the move. He picked up the Chinese checkers box and tossed it into the fire. Screw the Chinese. We watched silently as the flames licked the edge of the worn box before it caught alight and burned. It was a childish gesture of defiance, but somehow it made me feel better, and I could tell from the faces of the others that they felt the same. "So, I guess it'll have to be Monopoly. Or Trouble, if one of us sits out," Brooks said. "If you guys want to play Trouble, go ahead," I said. "I can watch the stew." "No," Sarah shook her head. "We all have to play. Let's play Monopoly." So that's what we did. It was like there was an unspoken agreement to give her everything she wanted that night. We played and talked and laughed and had fun, truly enjoying ourselves for the first time since we had all come together. For that few hours we managed to forget the horrors of the previous few weeks and simply be kids. The stew was delicious after days of cold food, and we all slept well that night, warm and comfortable in front of the fire. I wished we could have stayed there a few more days, or even permanently, but I knew that was not going to be possible. Luke and I decided that we were going to have to move on the next morning and travel hard before we found a place to hole up for a few hours before making a nighttime dash across Worcester. As I nodded off, I hoped that the dead pit bull had provided the pack with enough food to lose interest in us. Otherwise, our passage out of here into the city would be even more dangerous. After what happened the next morning, I stopped putting so much faith in hope. 15. I was in the kitchen gathering cans to take with us when it happened. A single piercing scream that transformed into shrieks of pain. I rushed into the living room, pulling my revolver from my pocket as I ran. The front door was open, and I burst through to find Sarah, surrounded by dogs on the lawn, about near where we'd left the bikes. Luke was already on the porch with the shotgun in his hands, but I could tell he was hesitant to shoot for fear of hitting Sarah. I brought the .38 up and pulled the trigger. It jumped in my hand as the report rang out. My aim was purposefully over the heads of the dogs and Sarah to scare them away. It didn't work. Some of the dogs shrank away, but others continued tearing at her. Her blood-curdling screams were muffled as she had been pushed face down into the snow by their assault. At the sound of my shot, Luke's hesitation broke, and he, too, leveled his gun, aiming at one of the dogs furthest away from Sarah. He squeezed the trigger, and the shotgun boomed. The Alsatian pitched over and lay twitching in the snow. The pack took more notice of us then, with all but one, a heavy American bulldog, forgetting Sarah and watching us warily, torn between food and self-preservation. The bulldog continued ripping at Sarah's shoulder, and she screamed in agony. I had a clean shot at a cadaverously thin Doberman and hit it in the head. From behind me there was a shout, and Ben rushed past us, charging at the dogs. He had the poker from the fireplace and swung it like a madman. "Bloody bastards! Leave her alone!" The remaining dogs yelped and gave ground before him, but not quickly enough. Ben brought the bar of the poker down hard upon the muscled back of the bulldog, and it squealed, turning to snarl at its attacker. Ben swung again, striking it on the side of its thick skull. It yelped before stumbling off in a weird, drunken manner. The last 3 dogs watched him just out of reach, their hackles raised, but not backing off. Ben picked Sarah up, hoisting her small, bleeding form over his shoulder. He ran to the porch with her and had almost made it when an emaciated mutt sank its teeth into the backside of his ski pants. Ben screamed in agony and dropped Sarah onto the steps while swinging behind him with the poker in a desperate attempt to dislodge the dog's jaw. Luke and I stepped forward at the same time. I grabbed Sarah under the arms and heaved her up onto the porch before picking her up. Just before I turned, I saw Luke place the shotgun against the mutt's chest and pulled the trigger. The last of the dogs scattered, and I heard Luke firing off more shots as I took Sarah inside. Placing Sarah gently in front of the fireplace, I looked her over as the others gathered around. She was unconscious, for which I was thankful. Her wounds were horrific. Her right arm and shoulder were mangled, and she had multiple bites on the other arm and on both legs. She was bleeding profusely from the shoulder, and even as a 15-year-old with no medical training, I knew that was not a good thing. Luke came in, helping Ben over to us. Ben was limping a little, white fluff protruding from the rips in his ski pants. He seemed to be angry rather than hurt. Brooke stood frozen in the kitchen, her face pale with shock. "Is she okay?" Luke asked. "Does she look okay?" I snapped. "What the hell was she doing out there?" She went out to get something from her bike basket. I told her not to go, but she snuck out. I said that we'd protect her, I said, as rage and anguish fought for control of my emotions, only realizing later that it was the first time I had felt those things since the death of my parents and sister. Brooke, go to the bathroom. See if there are some clean towels. We need to try to stop the bleeding. I'm sorry I couldn't get to a foster, Isaac, Ben said, sitting awkwardly on a living room chair with his wounded backside half off the chair. If I'd been foster, maybe. No blame is going to be passed around here today, I said, my voice cracking. We need to look out for each other, but we also need to be responsible for ourselves. Fuck! It was the first time I had ever heard Luke use an obscenity stronger than crap, and I heard anguish, anger, and, perhaps, regret in it. We did what we could to staunch the bleeding, and I made the call to build a fire in the fireplace to keep her warm. While it was dangerous to light a fire in the day, it seemed important to keep her comfortable. Brooke sat with Sarah's head in her lap in front of the fire, while I pressed towels to the wounds. Brooke had also found some peroxide, which I used as a disinfectant. Luke disappeared and came back with an old power cord, which he tried without much success to use as a tourniquet on her mangled shoulder. We sat like that for an hour, changing the towels as they became soaked. Eventually, Sarah stopped bleeding. I was relieved at first, until I realized that her chest wasn't moving. Her pale face was as peaceful and calm as I'd ever seen it. At least she stopped bleeding, Brooke said, using her finger to wipe a strand of hair from Sarah's brow. Maybe now she can start getting better. Luke, his face serious, looked at me and shook his head. I remembered a line from a book I'd read a long time ago. The dead don't bleed. Brooke continued to hold Sarah's head while I stood up and went to her brother. Ben was standing at the front window, leaning against the sill and looking out at the bloody snow and dead dogs scattered over the ground. How are you doing? I asked. I must say, I've been better, Ben said with a grimace. But after looking it over in the bathroom mirror, the bite on my bum isn't nearly as bad as it feels. I might be limping for a couple of days, but I'll live. Lucky I had jeans on under my snow pants. His teeth didn't break the skin, but it's pretty bruised. He looked at me, perhaps sensing that I wasn't only there to check up on him. Sarah? She's gone, I said quietly. Brooke doesn't realize it yet, but she went a few minutes ago. Damn it, Ben said, shaking his head. CPR? Shouldn't we try? It would have been no use. We couldn't stop the bleeding from her shoulder. It must have been an artery. He looked like he wanted to cry. Poor Sarah. Do you want me to talk to Brooke? If you could. I just don't know what to say. He nodded and pushed himself back from the wall. Can't say I know what to say either, he said, and started limping to where his sister sat by the fireplace, still holding Sarah and smoothing down her hair. I walked out onto the front porch, hand on the revolver in my pocket in case the dogs had returned. They were nowhere to be seen. I didn't know what to do. Should we try to bury Sarah? Just leave her body behind? I walked down the porch steps and gave the stiffening body of the Doberman a kick to the side. Tears spilled from my eyes, but this time rage won out, and I began kicking the dead animal over and over, again and again.